Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Mindfuel session today. Today, we're going to be talking about what can energy suppliers and utilities learn from leading tech firms about customer experience. I'm Sarah Nicastro, Field Service Evangelist, and I run Industry Resource Future of Field Service. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion, and I'm very excited to have with me Stephen Hooper, who is the Director of Preparo Consulting, and Stacy Sherman, who is the Director of Customer Experience and Employee Engagement at Schindler Elevator by day and runs blog doingcxright.com by night. Stacy and Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we dig into the conversation, I just want to turn it over to each of you to further introduce yourselves a bit and tell the audience a bit more about you. So Stephen, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I'm Stephen Hooper from the UK. I've worked in field service for the best part of 20 years now, delivering many programs largely across the UK utility industry, right from setting the initial strategy right through to delivering both the technology and change management that goes with a successful implementation.
Great. Stacy?
Yes, hi, I'm Stacy Sherman. I've worked in a lot of different industries, telecom for more than half my career, and a variety of companies. And basically my role, my passion is to humanize business, and through technology, which we need, but still humanizing that human factor through CX best practices and employee engagement as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for being here. I think what's exciting about today's conversation is that we really have a great intersection between utility expertise and CX expertise. And so the goal is to provide listeners today with some actionable insights on how to further their CX initiatives and goals. So we're going to be talking, about first, what pressures utilities are facing to improve customer experience and why it's such an imperative focus area. Real quick, before we dig in, I do want to just mention that you do have an opportunity to ask questions during today's event. I'll be keeping an eye on those. So if anything comes up that you would like to ask Stephen or Stacy, feel free to type those in as we go along. But to start, Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you to just kind of summarize for us what those pressures utilities are facing, what those pressures are to really focus in on this area of customer experience.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So certainly in the UK, the regulatory direction, it's a regulated industry in the UK, has certainly been to improve customer service. And that's to obviously increase the experience, improve the experience that customers get. But in order to do that, there's been some initiatives and mechanisms that have been put in place in the UK utility industry. Best example is the water industry. In previous years, there's been something called the Service Incentive Mechanism, or the SIM, which has measured the service that customers receive through the regulator Ofwat, and has done that by surveying customers after they've been in contact with the water utilities. That has now changed. So from April this year, that became CMEX, which is Custom Measure of Experience. And what that does is it still measures the level of customer experience that customers have based on whatever contact they have with the water company. But the change is that now it affects regulatory funding that they get through a regulatory period. So if they are in the top half of the table, they get increased funding. If they're towards the bottom of the table, then their regulatory funding can be decreased based on the service they give customers. And the idea here is that it mimics a competitive market, which is not in the UK, or certainly not for water or for gas and electricity distribution, and means that it keeps these companies on their toes and means that they're focused on providing good service to customers. But more widely, of course, it is imperative that there is good customer service anyway, not just because you've got to keep hold of your customers, which obviously for these guys is a problem, but also with things like social media. We take utilities for granted. So if something goes wrong and something isn't working right, the time to that actually getting out and the time to do something about it is now very minimal. So it's really important that the whole customer experience is managed very, very closely. And that obviously with a utility often involves a visit, and means that when the guy is actually there on the doorstep, that whole experience is managed very well as well. So really, this is sort of pressure we're coming under. As I say, in the UK, from a regulatory basis, which has a direct impact on funding, but from a much wider basis, the more immediate environment we find ourselves in means that customer service is extremely important to very obvious companies like utilities.
Good. So we were chatting a bit before we came on live that, when you look at sort of the continuum of different industries, there's a lot of CX focus and CX initiatives underway to varying degrees, right? And Stacy, your expertise spans multiple industries. So curious if you can speak to, how does what Stephen described compare with what you see related to CX in some other industries?
Yeah, so it's all the same in the approach. Doesn't matter what you sell, what service you deliver. It's understanding the customer experience, the customer expectations, getting their feedback, which is what Stephen talked about, through multi-sources, multi-channels, but really understanding what does your customer expect, and that's through the entire customer journey. From the moment they learn about you and buy and get set up and use and get help, there's a different experience, and you need to know what does the customer expect, and then how well are you delivering on that. So that applies not only understanding their expectation, but then using the insights to make improvements at each journey point. And then this is the part that a lot of companies don't do well enough, and that's close the loop. So when you make the changes based on what the customer either told you through structured surveys, as an example, or unstructured on social media, telling them what you did because of their feedback, it makes them feel valued and heard, and that applies to any company.
Okay. So Stacy, for listeners within the utilities industries that are looking to leading consumer firms for CX inspiration, what would you share as, some necessary first areas of focus?
Hire the right people, first of all, because people buy from people. They buy who they trust from. The brand is made up of people. So first thing is make sure you hire the right people, make sure you have the right CX champions at the top, and make sure that you have a culture where customer centricity is driven from the bottoms up as well. And if you start with the right culture and you train and educate everybody about CX, put the right measurements in place, you're going to have delighted customers.
Okay. So Stephen, what are some of the biggest challenges utilities face in improving CX? So you're hearing some of what Stacy is saying in terms of best practices, industry-wide, but from a utility specific perspective, where do those best practices run into, some challenges in actually bringing them to fruition?
So I think really the main challenge is a cultural one. Utilities have traditionally been a very asset-centric organisation, so they've been focused on those pieces of equipment that deliver water, gas, electricity into our homes or businesses. Really, where they're at now is the customer is much more important. The service that customer receives is absolutely paramount. So it's shifting that focus from being very asset-centric to being very customer-centric, which then starts to chime with a lot of things that Stacey's just been saying. And it's not just about the guys in the field, it's about the entire customer experience, the entire customer journey, right from that initial point of contact right through to the point where the issue is resolved or the question is answered. Which means that we need to think about that journey in its entirety. And certainly in the UK, there's been a huge focus on actually how to manage that journey. What are the channels that customers now want to use? Traditionally, you would pick up the phone to a utility and that would be about your only channel of communication. How do we use social media? How do we use websites? How do we use all the other channels for communication that are there to service the customers? And indeed, out of 5 potential channels of communication, Ofwat is now saying that 3 of them need to be online. So it's very much starting to shift that direction into what the customer expects, what the customer is used to using elsewhere, and what they are confident and comfortable using for that interaction. It also means that once we've got that, we've got to be able to manage that journey much better. So if a customer has an issue, how much information can we actually gain up front? How can we listen to the customer to make sure that we've gained the right information to resolve that issue as quickly as possible? The last thing we want is toing and froing, trying to gather more information as they go through that journey. Once they've had that initial contact, what we're really looking for is the ability then to act on it. And very much with field service, that means we can get the right resource out to the customer at the right time. They have got the information to deal with the problem when they get on site and give the customer the service that they expect and resolve the issue and get them back on power or back on water as quickly as possible. It's also about understanding potentially the history of that customer. So if the customer has unfortunately had different issues, how can the guy who turns up be informed in terms of what they need to do for that customer to provide the service? And then finally, how do we start to close that down? It's not just a case of the problems resolved. Utilities, by their very nature, often involve some quite invasive interaction. So it may be that there's some digging required, there's some sort of manual intervention required. So it's about making sure that everything is left the same way as it was found when you move away. So again, not getting almost to the point, but getting right to the end of the journey. And part of this is making sure that whoever's dealing with the customer at any point of that journey has the right information, has the right equipment, the right tools, the right abilities to service the customer all the way through. And we see that very much with lots and lots of other organisations now that customers are used to interacting with, especially as people come into the home, especially as the whole momentum builds and things happen quicker. We've got to make sure that utilities keep up with that momentum and are providing the customers with the experience that they're really looking for. And again, in the UK, with that regulatory league table, it means that if you're not doing it and your competitors are, then you're going to start to lose out. It's going to start to become very visible when that service isn't being required. So it's that whole cultural change. It's like turning the proverbial oil tank. It's going to take some time, but there is serious benefits to being able to do that. And I think, again, picking up on one of Stacey's points, what we are starting to see through the UK utilities industry as well is many more people starting to join at senior levels who have experience from very customer-centric organisations. So many of the utility businesses now are taking this very seriously, right from the top in terms of the ethos and the culture that they plan to follow, and then that starts to ripple through everything else that they do.
Okay,
If I can add something to that. So we agree, culture starts at the top and you need that CX expertise at the top. But when we talked about also the bottoms up approach, one of the things we do at my workplace, and we have service technicians going every day to customer sites, what's really important also is equipping your that front line with the customer feedback. So we put our customer surveys and information into their tools, their apps and such, so that they could read it before they go on site and know what the customer has said and what they're feeling, so that they can personalize those interactions. So I just wanted to emphasize that it is definitely at the top, but it's got to be driven throughout the organization, like best practices like that.
Good. So what I want to do next is do maybe a little bit of faux workshopping, if you will. So, Stephen's outlined some of the utilities specific challenges related to driving this CX culture and really making progress in this area. And Stacy, you've mentioned some of the important starting points, but if we were to take that a step further, and I'm hoping, Stacy, you could start, and then Stephen, you could weigh in, keeping the challenges in mind. If we were to sort of workshop in an effort to leave listeners with some tactical steps to take, some different notes to write down, what advice would you offer? And then Stephen, I'll give you a chance to add on to that. So Stacey?
Sure. So I would do two things sequentially. One, I would create a set of customer personas. Identify who are they that you're messaging to, that you're selling to, that you're delighting, right? Who are they? Define them, and then take each one that represents your segments and design the customer journey map. What is that ideal experience, right? From your internal view, I'd have all the people in a group who cover different organizations, different departments at the table. Design it together, but then take it to the customer and say, does this meet your needs? What's missing, right? So that it becomes with the voice of the customer, with the voice of employee, and then be able to create those experiences and continue to measure how you are delivering on that. So persona development and journey mapping are two very tangible things to do up front.
Yeah. Stephen, anything to add there?
No, I think that's exactly the right thing to do, and I've seen it work very well. But I think, especially within the utility industry, as I said previously, we're moving from a very asset-centric organisation to a customer-centric organisation. So I think everything Stacey says is absolutely right. I think what you then have to do on top of that is understand how your organisation needs to change to adopt those. So what are you going to have to do differently? What different behaviours are you going to have to demonstrate? And also potentially, what equipment and maybe systems are you going to need to start to deliver some of that? So again, back to one of Stacey's examples, in order to give the information to the guys on site, what do you need to make sure that the information you've gathered at the front end through those personas and through those journeys actually get translated into tangible actions that the guys can pick up on in the field?
Yeah, I know, you know, not too long ago, I mean, interviewing a utility company, that their method of communicating with customers is still sending paper letters. You know, we'll be there at X date to replace this or to read this, you know. So when you think about it that way, there is quite a ways to go in terms of modernizing that communication and modernizing that experience. So to your point, Stephen, you know, there's some foundational things you need to look at in that mindset shift of being an asset-centric business to a customer-centric business in, you know, how do we equip ourselves to even be able to deliver on these demands that we uncover. So that's a good point. And two other things, Stacy, you touched on that I just want to reflect on before we move forward is, you know, one is a critical misstep that I see across any industry that companies make when it comes to their CX initiatives, which is making too many assumptions about what is important to their customers. And so I think that, you know, in this race to try and improve, you know, sometimes one of the shortcuts that gets taken is to start assuming what it is your customers want or need, instead of taking the time to get that insight firsthand. And so then you find yourself down this path and making these investments and making these changes, all toward a goal that may or may not be hitting the mark. So that's just, I think, an important point to touch on, is to take that time to get that firsthand perspective on, you know, what does matter most to your customer base and what areas of change are going to be most critical to focus on. Go ahead.
Yeah. So two things. One is it's got to be quality over speed. And then secondly, some companies make the mistake of using just the employee feedback for the customer. And you can't do that. You marry both together, but it cannot replace. And that's something I want to caution people about.
That's a good point.
I think you're absolutely right. And within the UK as well, remember that the feedback, the customer feedback that you get afterwards through the regulator is what's going to determine your score. So there's absolutely no way that you can shortcut that. You have to interact with the customer. You have to get that real feedback to push into that journey. Otherwise, you're just not going to hit the expectation.
Yeah. The other area I wanted to reflect on is the intersection between customer experience and employee experience, right? And so we talked about, you know, you have this need to drive this new culture and to drive this new focus from the top down. And Stacy, you've mentioned it's also important to focus on bottom up. But I think another aspect that gets commonly overlooked is, you know, ultimately those frontline employees are the employees you're tasking with executing on this vision, right? So anyone in a leadership position can sit there and say, here's what we need to do differently, here's what our customers want, but you're relying on those frontline workers to go out and make that vision a reality. And to do that, you need to ensure that they are bought into that vision, that they're on board with executing it. And I know Stephen and you and I have talked about how in utilities specifically, that can be a pretty significant challenge. Yeah.
So,
but I think that's another important focus area, is how do we keep our employees engaged? How do we bring them along to be willing to be on this mission?
Yeah, and it certainly is. It's a transformation journey. And for me, that's not just about change. Change is something you do retrospectively. It's something that you might tweak. Transformation is actually changing the DNA of the organization. I think that's really what we're talking about in utilities. And there is so much they can learn from elsewhere. And, we've just got to look around at the way that we look to interact with other organizations, and we've got to reflect that and meet the expectations within the utilities as well.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Stacey?
Yeah, I was going to say we use a word I learned at the global corporation I'm at, which is drumbeat. It is a constant drumbeat around the CX best practices, and my team, we spend every day talking to our field. We've got over 60 offices in America alone, never mind every country we're present, and it's the constant drumbeat of talking about the best practices, going through the customer feedback with those individual branches, and celebrating the successes and using the other feedback, what you might call detractors, as coaching opportunities. And that's how it slowly happens, but it works.
That makes sense. I want to go back. We touched on this a bit, but I want to expand on it in discussing the role the field force plays in these CX efforts. So Stephen, I'll let you start, but I just want to talk about, again, the criticality of equipping the field force to be able to deliver on a better customer experience, and what some of those considerations might be.
Okay, so I think exactly right. Although we're talking about the overall customer journey, the face-to-face interaction is always going to be with the guy who turns up on the doorstep, or girl who turns up on the doorstep to carry out whatever activity needs to be carried out. So I think what we need to do is we need to equip them in several ways. Partly, we need to make sure they've got the right customer-facing skills in order to deal with the customers, in order to make sure they've got the right information to supplement what they turn up with, to make sure that they behave in the right way, to make sure that they understand what they are there to actually do. So I think firstly, we've got to equip them with those customer service skills. Secondly, we've then got to feed that. So we've got to make sure that when they turn up, that they've got that will be via technology, but they've got the right tools to do the job. So that they're able to interact with the systems, they're able to use the information that's been collected upstream, and also supplement that maybe historical information or asset information or other information that they may need to carry out whatever activity is there. We also need to make sure that upstream interaction works, so that we're sending somebody with the appropriate skills and the appropriate ability to resolve the issue that's there for the customer. The worst possible thing in the world is to turn up and then have to make a separate appointment for somebody else to come and do that. Really, the way we're going to delight the customers is that first time fix. The person who turns up is able to deal with the problem, be able to get you back to where you need to be, and do it in a clean, efficient way that leaves you feeling satisfied. So what we've got to do is we've got to make sure they've both got the technology and the personal skills in order to be able to carry that out for the customer. And then as well, make sure that they can close it down in the effective way. So be aware of what they're leaving behind. If you've had to dig up somebody's garden in order to fix a water pipe, make sure that you put the appropriate steps in place, that's going to be quickly and efficiently put right and put back to the situation that you found it in. And that's the bit that often gets forgotten. We've turned up, we've dealt with what the customer needs, we've dealt with the immediate issue, but we've got to make sure within these environments that we're satisfying everything, and we're putting everything back to the way that the customer expects it to be, and we complete the journey for them.
Good. Stacy, what would you add in terms of how companies across other industries are equipping their field force to deliver a really good customer experience?
Yes. So as I mentioned before, one of the things was giving them the customer feedback, making sure they get that directly, especially for the customers they serve.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it's education and setting expectations. So when you go on site, make sure you say hello. When you leave, say goodbye. It's some of the human basics that sometimes we're all so busy, you forget or you're in a rush, and holding them accountable to that. But also have safeguards. And what I mean by that is, especially right now where a lot of people are not on site, is leveraging technology. So we send text notifications to our callback customers to say, okay, ticket's been dispatched, technician on the way, job complete. And giving those text alerts or however the customer wants to receive it, it's a safeguard to make sure that they're getting the communication that they are looking for, while also making sure that the human factors do deliver that as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting when you start talking about this and you think about it from the perspective of the customer journey, right? And not to make assumptions about that journey, but just thinking about me, myself as a customer, right? You start to really envision the areas in which this can break down, right? So Stephen, some of the things you mentioned, you know, someone arriving without any information about what they're there to do, and or not having the right skills or the right parts to make that fix. So then you have to have someone else come back out, or someone without the soft skills, you know, to provide that human experience or to be respectful of someone's home, you know. And as you think through that impact on the customer journey, you know, I hope what listeners are realizing is how valuable your field resources are in your ability to achieve these CX goals. You know, and you're in a position where they're in a very precarious position, right? Because they're either well equipped and empowered to go there and be that positive face of your brand, or they take the fall for everything that probably wasn't their fault before they arrived on site. So it's just very important to realize the criticality of that resource and how that face-to-face interaction really is such a big part of this CX initiative. So very good points. I want to talk a bit about, and happy to hear from both of you. Stacy, maybe you can start. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see made related to CX efforts and CX initiatives? And, you know, what advice would you give our listeners on how to avoid some of those common missteps?
So the biggest misstep is all around communication. So at times, you know, things happen. We're human, we make mistakes. But what happens is the customer's waiting to hear what's the status, when's it going to be repaired, when you're going to show up, when you're going to come back. And sometimes, you know, the field is waiting on other factors to be able to complete the job. Well, I always say silence is not an option. At least pick up the phone, even if you don't have an answer or an update, to say, I haven't forgotten about you, right? I don't care what you're selling, what industry, it's all the same. We want communication, we want to know the updates. So it's in our control. And so that's where I would say the biggest mistake is people who don't really follow through on authentic communications and timely communications. And it's not hard to do. It's just, if you put yourself in the customer's shoes, you'll do it right because you understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. We live in the information age, right? So we're used to constant information, and in a customer experience perspective, when you're left wondering when, where, what, how, you know, that can be a big friction point. Stephen, what would you add?
I think that's absolutely right, but I think what we've got to remember as well that normally when we're dealing with people from a utility perspective, it's quite a stressful situation. Something has gone wrong with something that we take for granted, and it's always at the most inconvenient time. The water's gone off when you're trying to bath the kids or something like that. So information, absolutely right, is key, and that helps to diffuse that situation to a certain extent by setting expectation and setting that level of understanding of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And if something veers off course, communicate again and make sure that people are aware of what's going on. Another element I'd add in this particular situation is that you are expecting whoever that field person is to go into somebody's home on a large number of occasions to resolve these type of things. So again, we've got to make sure the customer is comfortable with that person going into their home. And part of it is the human skills when they turn up on the doorstep, but part of it can be communication beforehand. Some of these customers are quite vulnerable and really don't want to bring people into the home. So in order to do that, we need to make sure we're communicating who's going to turn up, when are they going to turn up, what do they look like, how can I be assured that they're actually from the organisation that I expect them to be. So, you know, there's some simple things we can do in the age of technology. That text message that says the engineer's on the way, well, it's Fred, and here's a picture of Fred, so you know who to let through the front door. These things are very, very simple things to do these days and give people a huge amount of assurance and adds an extra level onto that communication when we've got people in a stressful or vulnerable environment that can then actually ease that journey through for them and really build that experience that they have with the organisation.
Absolutely. Good. All right. Last question for today. I could talk to you guys for another hour, but I won't keep you that long. Last question for today. And Stephen, I'm going to start with you looking at this, you know, from the utilities specific standpoint. How do you see this focus and this path evolving within utilities over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think certainly in the UK, given the regulatory environment we're in, it will certainly accelerate. We've certainly seen it probably over the last 3 or 4 years really pick up pace, and I think that's only set to continue. I think you've got large organisations, and as I say, there's a huge amount of cultural change that needs to go on. So it's the momentum that can be given to that that's really going to make a difference. And certainly when we look at other organisations, when we order things for the house, furniture or whatever, we're seeing a massive push on customer service. We've got very high expectations set by these people. And I think we'll see the utility industry strive to follow that lead and try to catch up. Certainly, I know that Ofwat in the UK is targeting companies to be in the top 50 customer service organisations in the UK as part of this drive to build customer service. So I certainly think we'll only see the momentum build over the next few months or couple of years.
Good. Stacy, broadening that out and looking at sort of CX as a whole, you know, across a variety of industries, what do you see as the evolution taking place in the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I see more and more investment in CX, both in their hiring practice and in the tools and platforms. And that is because consumer needs are changing. They're changing so fast, and even more than we even understand it from COVID and past COVID pandemics. And so I believe that this is growing in importance. I'm so glad for that. And that's the trend, and it's just going to expand. I see it happening already.
Yeah, that's a good point. It would be a discussion all on its own, how COVID has impacted customer needs and customer wants. And, you know, as a result, how nimble and agile companies have become in working to quickly, you know, meet those changing needs. So very good points. We'll have to have a follow-up discussion sometime because there's plenty more we could talk about, but we are at time for today. So Stephen and Stacy, thank you both so much for being here and sharing your insights with our audience. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Be sure to visit mindfuel.ifs.com to check out some of the other great thought leadership sessions we have coming up soon. Take care.